Look at me, look at you, trying to
Yeah.
fight for rights. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for joining us. I'm Hannah Perez. Welcome to episode 1 of Modern Racism, looking at issues surrounding racism, learning how to better understand what it is, what it looks like, and what we can do about it. This podcast is hosted by myself and Victoria Arlano.
Hello everyone, I am Victoria and we are university scholars studying advanced issues in race and ethnicity. Today we'll be discussing some serious issues that are going on in our world. I know there are a lot of things going on today and it can be easy during this time to overlook our social responsibility to acknowledge our role in understanding and dismantling racial prejudice, racial discrimination, and racism in all forms. Before discussing issues surrounding racism, I'd like to define some of the terms we'll be using throughout the podcast. And in doing so, we'll be careful not to conflate the terminology used, allowing for a clear understanding of each and their consequences. The significance behind this is thoroughly explained in Carson Bird's journal, Understanding Modern Forms of Racism, and we'll be using many of the definitions from that publication for our terminology. Listeners can find this in our references, as it's a good foundation for understanding the evolution of racism in the United States. With that being said, prejudice is often at the individual level. It describes someone's attitudes about another group, which creates a negative generalization. Racial prejudice can be used to express overt bigotry and stereotypes. Racial discrimination, however, involves distinct actions and is often at the institutional level. It describes the unequal treatment of groups and can be used to express actions of powerful groups targeting those less powerful. Racism is usually defined as a combination of the two, where prejudice and discrimination are backed by power and authority, to overtly and covertly subordinate or disadvantage members of less powerful groups. Aside from being morally wrong, we must actively challenge and change racist systems because the effects of racism are significant. It is the key contributing factor in the onset of disease and for increasing disparities in physical and mental health among people of color. The burden of racism is associated with almost all socioeconomic disparities as well. So now that we have established what it is and why it's important, let's get into some of the topics surrounding racism in the present day.
In this episode, we will be going in depth on two forms of modern-day racism that are often overlooked and even accepted in society: colorism and colorblind racism. Many people who do not really experience or understand these might think that COVID-19 is a bigger problem, but in reality, issues like these will continue for marginalized groups suffering in school, work, and everyday life, while those that benefit from it will never view it as a priority. So let's start off with colorism. The problem with this is that colorism is a persistent problem for people of color, especially in the US. African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans have to experience colorism on the daily. In the article, The Persistent Problem of Colorism, Skin Tone Status, and Inequality by Margaret Hunter, she explains how in 2003, researchers found that lighter-skinned Mexican Americans and African Americans earn more money than their darker-skinned counterparts. Hunter also explains in her article that the skin color effect on education has been shown for African Americans and Mexicans. School counselors may also encourage lighter-skinned students of color to go to college more often than they encourage darker-skinned students. Students of color often valorize their lighter-skinned peers in terms of beauty, brains, and social status. So for me, as a once young student, I can agree on this. When I was in school, I would always think about what would happen if I was blonde and I was light-skinned. I always thought, people like that had more money and they were smarter than the others. Coming off of that, so although colorism affects both men and women experience discrimination based on skin tone in particular ways. Beauty provides women with status that can lead to advances in employment, education, and even the marriage market.
What's the difference between racism and colorism?
Well, to many people, these two words might mean the same to them, like both meaning not liking people of color, but it goes way deeper than that. So, as we all know, racism is the prejudice and discrimination that a marginalized minority group receives on the premise of their ethnic origin, while colorism is the treatment of people within a minority group based on their skin tone.
How do people benefit from colorism?
So, colorism can be beneficial for those who are lighter skinned. For example, they might get paid more than others, they might get better opportunities in school, and they might get treated better overall in life. So, for today, our special guest that we have this week is a Sacramento State student. She is a Latina American who has experienced this in her life.
Hello everyone, I'm going to explain my experience with colorism while working in retail. I'm a Latina woman and I have a darker complexion. I was born in America, but just because of my skin tone, I do get treated differently from others. One experience I had happened to me about 2 years ago when I was at a job interview for a retail store here in California. I ended up getting hired and the manager told me that the minimum wage at this place was $14 an hour. As I met other new hires who were also going to be working with me, I found out that they were getting paid $16 an hour instead of $14 an hour. I tried to ignore it because I naturally just thought, oh, maybe they have more experience or we're going to be working in a different department. But we were all cashiers. I noticed that these individuals were all of a lighter complexion or they looked white. I try not to make assumptions because we were in 2020, so I felt that this was something that shouldn't be an issue anymore, but I was curious, so I asked a coworker of mine who was African American. He had been working here for a while, and he told me that he was making $14 an hour. I was shocked because I didn't understand why, because me and my coworker, and I'm sure the other coworkers who were of a darker complexion were getting paid much less than people of a lighter complexion. I did my research on this company and come to find out they were prejudiced of those colors and would only hire them so people wouldn't assume they were racist. They wanted to seem like they were a diverse company who accepts everyone. I was in complete shock and just ended up staying at this retail company for a few months so I can find a new job. I should have said something or exposed this company, but many knew about them, and I was just a 19-year-old who was trying to work through college. I want people of color to really pay attention to who they work for, make sure they do their research of the company before accepting the job.
So again, thank you to our special guest for sharing her story with us. We appreciate that we got to hear your story, and we hope this really changes the view of how people think about this topic.
To follow that discussion, let's talk a bit about colorblindness, what it is, and how it perpetuates racism. I think Fitchburg State University defines the concept very well. They define it as the racial ideology that posits the best way to end racial discrimination is by treating individuals as equally as possible without regard to race, culture, or ethnicity. We can see how this doesn't seem apparently harmful, and as it was stated, some people believe that this is the best way to end discrimination. However, the belief does not take into account that racism exists in every institution in our country already. And I'm quoting here from attorney and TED Talk educator Tracy Ellis. It doesn't take into account that racism exists in our criminal justice system, with profiling and more punitive actions for people of color, in our healthcare system with an unequal access to care and inadequate care, in our educational systems where students of color are more likely to be suspended or to not graduate. In the labor force, essentially it's everywhere. It's just not negatively affecting white people, so in a way it's invisible for them. Especially invisible for those who believe that it's not their responsibility to do anything about racism.
How can the statement, "I don't see color," be problematic?
Statements like "I don't see color" or hashtag "All Lives Matter" can be problematic because if you are blind to color, you are blind to the consequences of color. You fail to see a person's color, then you fail to acknowledge their experience and their day-to-day struggles navigating through all of these systems that disservice them due to their color. If we agree that racism is a problem, which we have been able to do through countless decades of post-civil rights era study, then simply ignoring the problem without giving it proper discussion will not make it magically disappear.
Some people state that acknowledging race is divisive and further separates us as a society. Is this a possibility worth noting?
That's a good question, and to that I would say that we are different in terms of how different our experiences can be. It should be acknowledged and talked about not to further divide us, but to bring us together. There will always be animosity if the effects of systemic racism are not addressed and remedied. However, if groups that benefit from systemic racism take responsibility and actively try to understand the experience that many people of color face from a stance of respect and solidarity, we will be making steps towards creating a more united, more equitable nation. I'd like to introduce the concept of color consciousness here, which I hadn't learned about until recently, but I believe it was first used by author Kwame Appiah in his book discussing affirmative action and racial injustice. Essentially, it's the basis of affirmative action, however, at the individual conceptual level. It doesn't necessarily entail action, it's more of a way of thinking that should be exercised. In practice, we can do this by being actively curious about our differences rather than treating everybody the same, learning about the experience of marginalized people, and not to hold such a strong skepticism about microaggressions, profiling, and white prejudice. To learn about what systemic racism is and how it affects people of color, it also means to deeply acknowledge your privilege in regards to your color and how it has benefited you, and how color may be a barrier to others. This can be difficult for many if they hold a level of denial about their privilege, but the more we address it and encourage conversation, the more we can demand change. So let's continue to talk about it. Thank you all for listening. I hope you learned something new, and we hope you share it with someone new. Have a great day.
Thank you to everyone who got to hear what we had to say. If you liked our podcast, we publish a new episode every week on Wednesdays. And if you want, you guys can add us on Spotify or Apple Music. Yeah. Bye.